Welcome back, everybody. Today's deep dive is all about something I think we can all relate to: public speaking.
Yeah, presentations can be a real challenge for a lot of folks.
Absolutely. I mean, who hasn't sat through a boring presentation and thought to themselves, I wish I were anywhere else right now?
Uh-huh. Totally. But the cool thing is that the material we're looking at today is like this awesome masterclass in how to captivate an audience.
Okay, so tell me more about that. Where are we diving in today?
So we're diving into this lecture. It challenges this idea that great speakers, they're just born that way.
I was going to say, I always thought some people are just naturals.
Right. Well, the lecture really argues that anyone can become a compelling speaker
Yeah.
if they have the right knowledge and they put in the practice.
Okay, so no more excuses for me.
Right, exactly. The lecture uses this great example of Mary Lou Retton, the Olympic gymnast. Have you heard of her?
Yeah, of course.
So she tries skiing for the first time, right? And she's struggling. And the lecturer, who's a seasoned skier, realizes that his advantage wasn't talent.
It was just that he knew how to ski.
Yeah, it was knowledge and practice. It really gets you thinking about how much we can all achieve if we approach things with the right mindset. What skills have you thought you were just bad at?
Oh, man, so many. Like cooking, for example.
Hmm.
But maybe I just need more practice.
Exactly. So maybe you're not doomed to be a boring presenter after all.
I hope not. But where do we even begin?
Okay, so the lecture actually suggests that starting with a joke isn't always the best idea.
Really? Why not? I always hear that's how you warm up the crowd.
Well, they can be hit or miss, right? The audience might not be ready for a joke right off the bat.
I see, yeah, it might not land right. So what's the alternative?
This lecture suggests starting with what they call an empowerment promise.
Okay, so what is that?
Well, basically, you lay out what the audience will gain by listening to you.
Okay, so you're telling them up front what's in it for them.
Exactly. It's like saying, hey, stick with me for the next hour or whatever the time is, and I promise you'll walk away with some really valuable knowledge or skills or insights.
I like that. It sets the stage and makes the audience feel like they're on a journey with you.
Exactly. It's about making them feel like they are part of the experience and giving them a reason to stay engaged, right?
Especially in today's world of a million distractions.
Yeah.
All right, so empowerment promise check. What else does the lecture recommend?
Well, the lecture outlines 4 key techniques that they always try to keep in mind.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with them.
All right. Number 1 is cycling.
Cycling, like riding a bike.
Haha, not quite. It's basically repeating key points, but in different ways throughout your presentation. It's like planting seeds in the audience's mind.
I like that. So by the end, they've absorbed the message, even if they didn't realize it at first.
Exactly. It's subtle but effective. What about the next one?
Hit me.
Okay, so this one is called building a fence. What that means is clearly defining an idea and setting it apart from others.
You mean making clear distinctions between different concepts?
Yeah, it's about creating those boundaries so you prevent confusion in the audience's mind.
That makes sense. I think we've all been in presentations where the speaker jumps between ideas without making those clear distinctions.
Totally. And it's just overwhelming, right? It can be really hard to follow. And that leads to people zoning out and ultimately, just disengaging.
Yeah.
Clarity is key. Okay, technique number 3. This one is called verbal punctuation. And that's all about transitions and numbering your points using clear verbal cues to help the audience follow along.
But I love that. It's like giving them signposts along the way so they don't get lost.
Right. It shows respect for their time and their attention. And finally, the lecture stresses the importance of asking questions throughout your presentation.
Oh, I like that. It's like checking in with the audience and making sure they're still with you.
Exactly. It not only engages the audience, but also creates natural pauses, and it helps you as the speaker kind of gauge whether they're actually following along. And sometimes those questions that the audience asks can lead to some really interesting and unexpected insights.
I love that. It makes it more of a conversation than just a one-sided lecture.
Exactly. Now, beyond these core techniques, the lecture gets into some nitty-gritty stuff like the actual environment and tools you use. So, for example, it emphasizes having a well-lit room.
Yeah, dim lighting just makes everyone sleepy.
Exactly. You want your audience to be alert and focused, right? And then there's this hilarious tip for dealing with stage fright. Imagine your audience as disinterested farm animals.
Wait, what? That's amazing. I have to try that. But seriously, though, that's brilliant. It takes the pressure off, right?
Exactly. It's like setting the bar so low that anything else feels like a win. But what about visuals? This lecture actually has some strong opinions about using blackboards versus slides.
Interesting. So what's the verdict?
Well, The lecturer argues that blackboards are often superior to slides. They allow for a more dynamic presentation style, and the speed of writing on a blackboard kind of mirrors the pace at which people typically absorb information.
I can see that. It's like being back in a classroom where the professor's sketching out ideas on the board.
Exactly. It feels more organic and less like you're just clicking through a bunch of pre-made slides. And get this, the lecturer even points out that a blackboard can serve as a target for nervous hands, which can actually be a helpful way to channel nervous energy.
Uh-huh. I never thought of it that way. But it makes sense. So, is the lecturer saying slides are bad?
Not necessarily, it's more about how they're used. The lecture emphasizes that slides are better for showcasing visuals or summarizing key points, but they shouldn't be the main focus.
That makes sense. You don't want your slides to steal the show. But speaking of slides, the lecturer does call out some common crimes against slides.
Oh yes, there are quite a few. Too many words on a slide is a big one. And reading directly from the slides, ugh, we've all seen that. It's painful.
Oh, absolutely. And then there are small fonts that make you squint, excessive use of laser pointers, and just overly designed, cluttered slides that give you a headache just looking at them.
Totally. It's a whole rogues gallery of presentation pitfalls. And the lecturer even tells this funny anecdote about encountering a nervous job candidate at an airport who is seeking feedback on their overloaded slides.
Oh my gosh, that's too funny. So if we're not supposed to cram our slides with bullet points and paragraphs of text, what's the alternative?
Well, the lecture suggests using strong visuals, minimizing text, and allowing time for the audience to actually read any important text you do include.
So it's about creating slides that complement your presentation, not overpower it.
Exactly. And beyond just the mechanics of giving a presentation, the lecture also talks about how to make your ideas really stand out and be remembered. They introduce this cool framework called Winston's Star.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So each element in the framework starts with the letter S. First, you have symbol. It's basically a visual representation of your work. Think of it like a logo or a simple image that really captures what you're talking about.
Okay, got it. So what's the next S?
Next up is slogan. It's a memorable phrase that encapsulates your idea, like a tagline for your presentation.
Something that sticks with people. Okay, what's the third one?
Okay, number 3 is surprise. And that means having something unexpected, something that challenges assumptions or makes people think differently.
Oh, I like that. So you're keeping your audience on their toes.
Exactly. And the fourth S is for salient idea. This is a key concept that you want your audience to remember.
So it's like the headline of your presentation.
Yeah.
The thing that really grabs their attention.
Precisely. And finally, you have story, which is all about weaving a narrative that explains your process, why it matters, and its significance.
I love that. Stories are such powerful tools for connecting with an audience and making complex ideas more relatable.
Absolutely. And, the lecturer actually uses their own research as an example. They talk about how they accidentally incorporated all 5 elements of the star into their work, and they believe that's one of the reasons it became so successful.
Fascinating. It really shows that it's not just about the content of your work, but also how you present it. So we've talked about the beginning and the middle of a presentation, but what about the ending? How do you wrap things up in a way that leaves a lasting impression?
Well, this is where a lot of presenters falter, according to this lecture. They tend to resort to weak or generic endings that just leave the audience feeling flat.
Okay, I'm guilty of that sometimes.
Yeah.
Just kind of trailing off or rushing to a generic thank you slide.
Yeah. So what are some of the crimes against endings we should avoid? Well, for one thing, don't end with a long list of collaborators. It can make it seem like you didn't actually do that much of the work yourself.
Right, it kind of dilutes your own contribution. Okay, what else?
Another pitfall is ending with a totally generic conclusion like, well, that's all I have, or any questions? It's just so anticlimactic.
Ugh, yes. Such a letdown. Anything else?
Well, believe it or not, the lecturer actually advises against ending with just a simple thank you.
Really? I always thought that was the polite thing to do.
Well, they argue that it can imply that you think the audience was bored and that you're just glad it's over.
Wow, I never thought of it that way,
Yeah.
but I can see their point. So what are some better ways to conclude?
Well, the lecture suggests a few alternatives. One option is to end with a joke. But of course, it has to be appropriate and well delivered.
So a good joke can be a nice parting gift.
Exactly. Another option is to use what they call a benediction-style ending, like you might hear in a political speech, something that creates a sense of closure and leaves the audience feeling inspired.
Oh, so like a call to action or a final thought that leaves them feeling empowered.
Exactly. And then there's the approach of saluting the audience, which is all about expressing genuine appreciation for their time and engagement, but in a more personalized way than just a generic thank you.
That feels a lot more sincere.
Right. And ultimately, the lecturer emphasizes that the best way to find your closing style is by observing other skilled speakers and experimenting to find what works best for you.
That makes sense. It's like with any skill practice and experimentation are key.
You know, it's like when you're learning to ride a bike. You can read all the instructions, watch all the videos, but until you actually get on that bike and start pedaling,
You won't really get it.
exactly. This lecture really emphasizes that. Like, we learn by doing, by observing others, by experimenting.
So find your own voice as a presenter, right? Take inspiration from others, sure, but ultimately you have to figure out what works for you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, blend those techniques with your own personality, your own passion for the topic, all that.
Now, this lecture goes into some specific situations too, like job talks. Those can be pretty nerve-wracking.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes are high, and you've
Oh.
only got a limited time to make a good impression. The lecturer talks about this conversation they had with some colleagues who were on a hiring committee.
Okay,
All right.
interesting. So what do they say?
Well, they were talking about what they look for in a candidate during a job talk, and two things came up right away.
I'm listening. What were they?
They said that candidates need to show that they have a vision, like a
Yeah.
clear sense of direction for their research.
Oh, so it's not just about presenting your past accomplishments, but also where you're going in the future.
Exactly. Show them you're not just competent, but you're a visionary. And the second thing,
Yeah, what was the second thing?
candidates need to show they've actually accomplished something. Like their research has produced concrete results.
So it's about finding that balance between big picture thinking and showing you can actually deliver.
Right. You need to show them both the dream and the proof. And here's the kicker. They said candidates only have about 5 minutes to establish these two things.
5 minutes.
Oh,
That's not a lot of time.
I know, right? You have to be so strategic about how you present your work. So how do you make those 5 minutes count?
Yeah. What did the lecture say about that?
So the lecture suggests starting by articulating the problem you're tackling and the approach you're taking to solve it. Grab their attention right from the start.
Yeah, make them lean in and want to hear more.
Exactly. Then you need to outline the steps you've taken to address that problem. Highlight those key contributions you've made along the way.
It's like a mini version of that empowerment promise we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
You're showing them why they should invest in you and your research.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's also super important to emphasize the significance of your work, why it matters in the grand scheme of things. Leave them feeling inspired and excited about the potential impact.
Okay, this is all great advice for anyone preparing for a job talk. Really helpful stuff.
Absolutely. It's about crafting that narrative that showcases your skills, your vision, and your passion. Okay, so I've talked about job talks. This lecture also touches on the idea of getting famous.
Getting famous. Okay. I'm curious. How does that tie into all of this?
Well, so the lecturer tells this story about attending a fundraising event where they were seated next to Julia Child.
Wow, the Julia Child. That's amazing.
Right. And all night, people kept coming up to her, for autographs and telling her how much she'd changed their lives with her cooking shows and cookbooks.
I can only imagine. So what happened?
So at some point, the lecturer finally asked her, "Is it fun to be famous?" And Julia Child's response was, "You get used to it."
I guess it just becomes part of life after a while.
But then the lecturer had this realization, you never get used to being ignored.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful thought.
It is, right? And the lecturer makes this really interesting analogy. They say your ideas are like your children, and you don't want to send your children out into the world in rags.
That's a great analogy. Dress them up for success, make sure they're seen.
Exactly. Present them in a way that captures attention.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we make sure our ideas aren't ignored?
This is where Winston Starr comes back into play. Those 5 principles: symbol, slogan, surprise, salient idea, and story. Use them to create a presentation that sticks with people.
Package those ideas in a way that people remember.
Yes, and the lecturer actually uses their own research as an example. They talk about how they accidentally incorporated all 5 elements into their work, and they think that's one reason why it was so successful.
That's so interesting. Even an accidental application of those principles can make a big difference. Okay, so we've talked about the beginning and middle of a presentation. Let's talk about the ending again. What are some more concrete strategies for wrapping things up in a way that leaves a mark on the audience?
The lecturer is really adamant about this. The ending is your last chance to connect with your audience and drive home your message. You want to leave them feeling inspired, informed, and ready to take action.
Yeah, you don't want to just rehash what you've already said.
Right. It's about that sense of closure, but also leaving them wanting more. The lecture suggests a few different approaches. Okay, so one option is to end with a joke. But it has to be the right kind of joke, appropriate for the setting, well-timed, and of course, actually funny. If you can pull it off, it can leave the audience on a high note.
Yeah, good joke can be a nice way to end things. But yeah, I imagine it's a bit risky.
It definitely is. Requires a good sense of comedic timing. Another approach is to use what they call a benediction-style ending.
Benediction, like a blessing.
Yeah, kinda. You often hear this in political speeches, that sense of closure and inspiration, almost like a call to action.
So you're leaving the audience with this feeling of empowerment and hope.
Exactly. And then there's the approach of saluting the audience.
Okay, remind me what that is again.
It's where you express genuine appreciation for their time and engagement, but in a more personal way than just a generic thank you.
So you might mention something specific that you enjoyed about the presentation or something you learned from the audience's questions.
Exactly. It shows you were really present and that you value their input. And the lecturer really stresses that the best way to find your own closing style is by observing other great speakers and just experimenting. See what works for you.
That makes sense. So it's not just about finding the right words to end your presentation, but also about how we think. This lecture also suggests that stories play a huge role in shaping our thinking.
Yeah, the lecturer argues that we are essentially storytelling animals. Our thinking skills develop through narratives, from the fairy tales we hear as kids to the complex case studies we might analyze later in life.
It's about seeing how all those facts and figures fit into a larger story and drawing meaning from those connections.
Right. And the lecture goes on to say that if we want to teach people to think critically, we need to give them good stories. Ask thought-provoking questions about them. Give people the tools to analyze those stories.
So don't just tell people what to think, but give them the tools to think for themselves.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to become critical thinkers. People who can engage with complex information and form their own informed opinions.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. Really eye-opening.
Me too. I feel like I've learned so much about public speaking and just communication in general.
I love how this lecture really encourages us to find our own voice as speakers, to be authentic and engaging, but also to really challenge our audiences to think deeply.
Absolutely. It's about creating a truly impactful experience for everyone involved.
Well, on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a question. Think about a presentation or lecture that really stuck with you. What techniques did the speaker use to achieve that impact? And how can you apply those same principles to your own presentations to make your ideas stand out and be remembered? Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time.
See you next time.